Hello everyone, we will continue with our discussion. But as a way of review, what again are the essential requisites of a contract? Always remember COC, we have consent, object or subject matter, and cause or consideration. Today, we will be discussing more about consent. So what are the elements of a valid offer and acceptance? Remember that when there is a contract, both parties must agree with each other. So for example, nanghinam ka sa imong friend og 100,000. Karon nito bag imong friend ay wala ko'y 100,000, ako mapahiram sa imo is 80,000 lang. So niya na napud ka nga 85,000 lang go ipahiram sa ako In this kind of situation, there is no contract yet. When you are negotiating for a contract, you undergo with different negotiations. So what are the elements of a valid offer and acceptance? So kung naay gi-offer sa imuha nga 80,000, kanus ani mo siya dawaton ug kanus ani ingon silo nga naanay acceptance. So what are the elements of a valid offer and acceptance? Your offer must be definite, intentional, and complete. These are the elements that make up an offer. An offer is an expression of willingness to contract on certain terms with the intention that it shall be binding as soon as it is accepted by the person to whom it is addressed. So kung nanghiram kag 100,000, ang imong friend mo offer lang sa imo og 80,000, unya ni negotiate ka og 85,000 pero imong friend ang iyang kwarta 80,000 ra gyud, the moment you accept it, there is already the meeting of the minds. Pero unsa may requisites of an effective offer? The one offering must have serious intention to be bound by his offer. So kung ang iyahang ipahiram sa imo was 80,000, he must be very serious kay tungod na agad siya kwarta nga pwede ipahiram sa imuha. Second, terms of the offer are certain, definite, and complete. Third, the offer must be communicated by the offerer to the offeree. So, di ba, gi-communicate sa imong friend nga 80,000 na gyud ang iyang pwede pahiram sa imuha. So, for example, na kay baligya nga bangko. Ang imong baligya sa bangko is 50,000. Niingon ng imong client, ay, dili na ko na kaya ng 50,000. Pag ingon sa imong client nga dili niya kaya ang 50,000, that is what we call qualified acceptance. Unsay but pasabot kung ay qualified acceptance? A qualified acceptance constitutes a counter offer, meaning wala mo nagkasinabot kay iya ko nung gidawat, paliton niya, pero naa siya'y qualified acceptance, na siya ginatawag nato nga counter offer. It is presumed that the contract had been entered into the place where the offer was made. So, kung asa na gi-offer sa imuha, ang contract perfected anang lugara. Acceptance made via telegram is binding only from the time the acceptance is known. So for example, na maligya ka og bangko, ni text ka or ni chat ka dito kang si palitan ni akong bangko biog 50,000. Pag reply ni si alas 12 sa gabi, ningon siya nga paliton nako na, pero nadawat nimo ang reply ni si alas 4 sa kadlaw, kanus ama na perfect ang acceptance. The acceptance is binding only from the time the acceptance is known. So dili alas 12 sa gabi na perfect ang contract, kundi alas 4 sa kadlaw. Offer and acceptance concur only when the acceptance has reached the knowledge of the offerer, not at the time of sending. So kanus anay acceptance? From the moment nakabalo na ka nga paliton ang bangko. Another example, last Monday na maligya ka og cake kang A. Niingon si A pagka Tuesday, sige, paliton na ako na nga cake. Pero nakabalo ka nga, paliton di ay ni A ang cake pagka Wednesday. Kanus ang acceptance na hitabo pagka Wednesday, dili pagka Tuesday nga naman. Offer and acceptance concur only when the acceptance has reached the knowledge of the offerer, not at the time of sending. Again, let us review consent, offer, and acceptance. Example, S advertised his BMW car for sale at 6 million. So the stage of conception, this is where B goes to S and offers to buy the BMW for 5 million. Pero si S, willing lang siya nga ibaligya ang iyahang BMW for 5.8 million. B again makes another offer to buy at 5.5 million. So wala pa sila nagkasinabot. This is what we call the negotiating stage or the stage of conception. What is the stage of perfection? S agrees to B's offer to buy the BMW at an amount of 5.5 million. Here, the contract is perfected. There is already a mutual agreement as to the object and cost of the sale. Unsa man ang stage of consummation? Stage of consummation occurs when S delivers the BMW car to B. B then pays to S 5.5 million purchase price. Unsa nay nahitabuan nga stage? Here, the parties comply with their respective prestations under the contract. It is in this stage that the obligations of the parties are completely extinguished. So, nahuman na. Now, consent is very important because it means that you have mutually agreed all the terms and conditions in your contract. Pero unsa man ang vices of consent, mao ni siya ang mga moment nga dili ka gusto mo enter into contract pero napugos ka kay tungod na ilad ka or gihadlok ka. When there are vices of consent in a contract, the contract is voidable because of MIVUF. Ma'am, unsa nang MIVUF or MIVUF? We will enumerate later. But first, let us define what are vices of consent. The vices of consent can be defined as those circumstances affecting the nature of consciousness and the free will to conclude a legal act. Remember, mo enter ka into contract because nagkasinabot mo. Pero nay ubang tao ni enter into contract because of MIVUF or MIVUF. What is that? When we say MIVUF, we mean mistake, intimidation, violence, undue influence, and fraud. So in entering into a contract, kung naa gani mistake, intimidation, violence, undue influence, and fraud, ang inyong kontrata voidable. Nganuman, there are vices of consent. Unsay vices of consent? Mo ni siya ang mga circumstances nga gipugngan ang imong free will to decide to enter or not to enter into a contract. Let us first discuss mistake under Article 1331. Mistake refers to mistakes of facts, and this occurs when mistake as to identity vitiate consent only when mistake must be either with regard to the identity of qualification of one of the parties. So for example, nipalit ka sa iyaha og bugas kay taga-banay-banay kuno siya ug sila mismo ang nigaling sa bugas pero dili man di ay, or identity or qualifications are the principal cause of the contract. So meaning, nipalit ka og sakyanan kay tungod mama siya sa imong uyab when in fact dili day siya mama pero silingan ra di ay sa imuhang uyab. That is what we call mistake of facts under identity. Now, what is mistake of law? And this is under Article 1334. These are mistakes which arise from an ignorance of a provision of law. So, giilad ka, giingnan ka nga. Pagbutang baya sa imong mama, pag namatay na imong mama, kinahanglan nimo na paliton. Nya, gipalit nimo ang butang sa imong mama when in fact, when your mother dies, automatically, ang mga butang sa imong mama must be passed on to you. Okay, so nailad ka nga naman kay wala ka kabalo sa law. For example, we have here Lita, Leia, and Anesito. Diri sa Philippines class, kung namatay ang imuhang parents, unya daghan mo mag-igsuon, mag-execute ka og extrajudicial settlement of estate. Unsay pasabot ana? Kanang extrajudicial settlement of estate, isa na siya ka contract or deed nga nagaingon nga gihati-hatian ninyong mag-igsuon ang kayamanan sa inyong mama o papa. So let us take a look at this example. Unsay nahitabo? Leia is the only legitimate child of the late spouses Anisito and Lita. She finished grade 3 and did not understand English. So si Leia daw filed an action to declare the nullity of the extrajudicial settlement of estate over her parents, which she was made to sign without the contents thereof, which were in English. Okay, so si Leia unsa daw grade 3 lang siya. Gipapirma siya sa extrajudicial settlement, walay unod, katong naanay unod, English pagid pagkasulat. She claims that her consent was vitiated because she was deceived into signing the extrajudicial settlement. Question: is the extrajudicial settlement of estate of Lita and Anisito valid? The answer is no. Nga naman, when one of the parties is unable to read, kung di ka basa ang isa ka party, or if the contract is in language not understood by him, kung di siya kasabot sa language, and mistake or fraud is alleged, the person enforcing the contract, so katong nagpapirma sa imuha, must show that the terms thereof have been fully explained to the former. In this case, class, Leia was not in a position to give her free, voluntary, and spontaneous consent without having the document, which was in English. Wala na siya gi-explain sa iyaha. Therefore, the consent of Leia was invalidated by a substantial mistake or error, rendering the agreement voidable. Hence, the extrajudicial settlement of estate should be annulled and set aside on the ground of mistake. Another example, Apa and Tim entered into a contract which they intended should result in a co-ownership between them. So, ano sila, pirma tag kontrata nga kitay tag-iya aning balaya. However, since Tim cannot read and understand English, Apa manipulated the contract which turned out later to be a mortgage. So, mo ni siya yung mga mistake of facts. Kay abi niya, ang yung gipirmahan co-ownership, dili di ay contract di ay of loan. Let's go to Article 1335, violence or intimidation. Violence. In order to wrest consent, ang violence dapat daw serious or irresistible force is employed. For example, pirmahin na ato ang marriage contract. Kung dili ni mo na pirmahan, patyon tika. Or pag ingon niya nga pirmahin na, gitutukan kag baril, gitutukan kag kutsilyo, that is what we call violence. What are the requisites for violence to be considered as a vice of signing a contract? Number 1, physical force employed must be serious or irresistible. Meaning, naa diha ang violence, dili na pwede likayan, or it is the determining cause for a party in entering into a contract. Kay tungod na ay violence, na ay physical force, which is serious or irresistible, hing pirma na lang ka sa kontrata tungod sa imuhang kahadlok. Unsay intimidation? A party is compelled to give his consent by a reasonable and well-grounded fear of an evil, or the evil must be imminent and grave, it must be unjust, and the evil is the determining cause for the party in entering into a contract. One of the contracting parties is compelled by a reasonable and well-grounded fear of an imminent and grave evil upon his person or property, or upon the person or property of his spouse, descendants, or ascendants to give his consent. So for example, nakaligis ka, human gipapirma ka og kontrata. Giingnan ka nga, kung di ka mo pirmaan na atong kontrata, idemanda ti ka. Is that intimidation? Is there force? Is there an irresistible evil or imminent evil? The answer is no. A threat to enforce one's legal claim in court does not amount to intimidation nor vitiate consent. Nga naman, threat man na future, dili diha-diha ang kahadlok. To determine the degree of intimidation, the age and condition of a person shall be borne in mind. So for example, naay bata ni duol sa imuha ni ingon nga, ante, pirmahin ni akong parents consent kay mo appeal kong field trip. Kung di ni mo na pirmahan, tuslukon tikaan ning kutsilyo. Unya ang nanghadlok sa imuha perti pang bata 5 years old. Is that intimidation? No, nga naman, you must consider the age, the sex, and the condition of the person in front of you. If consent is reluctant, a contract is valid even though one of the parties entered into it against his wishes and desires. Kung hingpirma ka ng parents' consent, nga githreat ra kas 5 years old, dili na siya pwede maging void. Example, so naatay duha ka lalaki na sila'y mga kabit. Julian and OJ had a public spat, flaunting their mistresses. So nag-awayay sila, ikaw kabit ni mo si Kuan, kabit ni mo si Kuan. Julian tells OJ to sell the latter's Davao property, otherwise Julian will expose OJ's extramarital affair. So niya na siya, huy, ikaw OJ, pag di nga ni ka mo pirma ning yuta nga gusto na ko ibaligyan ni mo sa kuha, istoryahan na ko imong asawa nga nade kikabit. Sa kahadlok ni OJ, ni pirma si OJ. Is this a vice of consent? The answer is no nga naman, because the expose is a public interest issue. Dili man siya personal, dili siya grave. Another situation, Julian and OJ had a public spat, flaunting their mistresses. Julian tells OJ to sell the latter's Davao property, otherwise Julian will expose OJ's extramarital affair. Julian also pointed a gun on OJ's girlfriend. OJ agreed. Is this a vice of consent? The answer is yes. OJ is compelled by a reasonable and well-grounded fear of an imminent and grave evil nga naman. Gitutukan naman siya baril upon his property, his person, or his spouse to give his consent. Let's go to 1337, undue influence. A person takes improper advantage of his power over the will of another, depriving the latter of a reasonable freedom of choice. So for example, na kay teacher, nga ikaw dato ka, ningon ng teacher, huy, pautang ako. Pila man imong tangon, ma'am? 50,000. Ay, ma'am, mula ko'y kwarta. Nagiing na nimo nga, pautang ako. Kung di ka magpautang, ibagsak ti ka. Pirmahin na, na nga, pautangon ko nimo. That is what we call undue influence nga naman gigamit ni teacher ang iyang power over the will of another. It is determined as to whether or not the influence exerted has so overpowered and subjected the mind of the contracting party as to destroy his free agency. So unsay circumstances nga makonsider nato na undue influence, unsay imong tan-awon? The confidential, family, spiritual, and other relations between the parties, mental weakness, nangilad ka sa taong di kasabot, ignorance, and financial distress. Let us go to 1338, causal fraud, pagpangilad. Kano sa man na causal fraud? Insidious words or machinations of one of the contracting parties is used to persuade the other to enter into a contract without which he would not have agreed. Kini siya mga pagpangilad. Nagamit og mga flowery words, pinaingon, pirma ani, kay kung mo pirma ka ani, makaadto kag Japan, dito sa Japan, daghan kayong kwarta giilad ka, pero ang imong gipirmahan di ay contract of loan. Tanaw tag example. Kay mo na sila, mag-amigo ni sila, niya ang isa nagagitara. Unsay situation ani ma'am? Jack is selling a guitar to River and the representation is that this guitar was used by Paul McCartney. Ano siya? River, palitan niya akong gitara. Kay kini ang nagamit ang gitara si Paul McCartney. Kailan mo ng Paul McCartney? Siya sikat kay na siya nga singer sa unang panahon. Wa siya laing gitara nga gigamit kundi kini ra gyud. It turned out that it was used by Jack only. Wala din na gigamit ni Paul McCartney. But based on that information, kahing salig si River niya, idol niya si Paul McCartney. River purchased the guitar. This is an example of a causal fraud. It is the inducement of Jack using a made-up fact that caused River to purchase the guitar. Another example, so kini sila mag-amigo ni sila na maligya silang engagement ring. Hing-ingon ning tindera, uy palitan ning engagement ring kay diamond ni mahal kaayo. Unsa di situation ani, let us read. Jack sold to River a stone which Jack represents as a diamond of certain carat. River is a jeweler. River cannot claim fraud because he's in the business. So man siya, ay giilad ko ani ni Jack, ingon siya nga 3 carat ni. Unya, dili man da ito tinuod nga diamond. Dingon sa River, ay giilad ko ni Jack, pwede ba na? Dili pwede. Nga naman, River ought to know since he is a jeweler. Nagabaligyo siya galahas na siya'y pawn shop. So no amount of misrepresentation by Jack will amount to fraud considering the capacity to get the correct information.